So welcome, croeso I Heolion, Wyth Cymdeithas. Welcome to Pillars of Society, and the last in our series of public talks. This week we are joined by academic Rhys Kaminski-Jones, who will talk about his research into Picton and the Gorsedd, and Molara Awen, a singer and community artist, who will talk about her work with Race Council Cymru. Fy enw I ydy Emily Loro. My name is Emily Loro, and I am Community Art Coordinator at Oriel Martin Gallery. Describe myself, I'm a white woman in my 40s with white glasses and long hair. This project is funded by the 15-minute Heritage Grant Programme, a collaboration between the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Cadw, the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We've removed the option to unmute yourself this week until we get to the breakout rooms. So people who came to the last talk will understand why that was. We didn't get a chance to do breakout rooms last week because there were a lot of interruptions, and that takes up a lot of time. So it'll be questions in the chat. Please make use of the chat function, and we will hopefully have a chance to discuss in small groups at the end of the event tonight. You can turn off the camera if you like, get comfy, come and go, whatever works for you. We will be recording and transcribing the event tonight and releasing it on our YouTube channel. There are already some of the talks on the YouTube channel, so have a look at them if you've missed any. We are behind with transcribing. It's quite an arduous task. There's a software, but it doesn't deal very well with Welsh names and things like that, so it has to be picked through. If anybody wants to volunteer for that role, please get in touch. We will have a break between our speakers, and we should be finished before 9 p.m. So Heolion Wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society is an Oriel Martin Gallery community project. For those of you who are new to the gallery, Oriel Martin is the main publicly funded art and crafts gallery for South West Wales. We are currently closed, of course, but there's lots and lots of things happening. We've got a new website. We took the opportunity to have our website revamped, and we will be launching it very, very soon. So keep an eye on our social media for that. We have a lovely podcast with Helen Booth, whose work is in the gallery, even though we're not open. There's a virtual tour you can do of that exhibition. And we'll be very, very busy over the Easter holidays with Crwg Celf, the wonderful Arts Council of Wales programme for more able and talented children in art. So the project, Heolion Wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society, will investigate the statues and monuments in Carmarthen, specifically the Picton Monument and the statue of William Knott and their accompanying colonial history, the Crimean War Memorial, and two iconic symbols of Welsh identity, the Gorsedd stones and Gwynfor Evans's plaque. The project is a response to the national and international debate around public art and colonial history. And the Welsh Government's report into statues and monuments came out, I believe today or yesterday, this week anyway, and it's really, really fascinating. We hope the project will provide an opportunity to discuss race, equality, diversity, Welsh identity, language and independence, and the experience of Wales as coloniser and colonised. We've been working very closely with students from Carmarthen School of Art who have participated in a series of workshops with artists and created designs for alternative works of public art. So we're at a very exciting stage of the project now. The students have submitted their work, and we have selected the ones to go into the augmented reality app. It's a very, very exciting moment of the project. We are hoping to unveil the augmented reality app and an accompanying map and walk around Carmarthen on the 8th of May. That's our provisional date, but obviously it's quite hard to plan things at the moment with COVID regulations changing. So again, have a look at our social media. There'll also be new interpretation on the website, which you can, and you can get to the website and the augmented reality app via QR codes that will be put up around. We would love your feedback on the project, and it's kind of the moment to really submit your feedback if you haven't already on the project so far, because those feedback forms will be disappearing off the internet soon. And then we'll have another feedback form at the end of the project. So I'll put a link to those feedback forms into the chat. We have a dedicated Facebook page for the project, so check that out, Heolion, Wyth, Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society. So now I would just like to introduce our speakers. So we are very lucky tonight to have Dr. Rhys Kaminski-Jones with us. Rhys heard about the project and got in touch, and his area of study fits so well with the project. It's really, really wonderful. It's really lovely to have him, and we're very lucky that he agreed to do a talk for us this evening. So Rhys is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Wales, St David in Aberystwyth. He grew up in Cydweli and went to school in Carmarthen. He's currently writing a book about the relationship between Welsh cultural revivalism and empire. So Rhys, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much for that introduction, Emily. And I'm just going to fiddle around with sorting out my PowerPoint presentation before I start talking to you all. Okay, so yes, my name is Rhys Kaminski-Jones. I'm a lecturer at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and working on a book, as Emily said, about the links between Welsh culture and Britishness and empire during the 18th century. But I'm also, as Emily said, someone who went to school in Carmarthen. And so what I'm going to do a bit in this talk is to mix myself speaking as an academic and hopefully saying giving some useful information in my role as an academic that helps understanding of these topics, but also giving a slightly more personal response that is based on the fact that this is a town that I grew up in. I do want to say a couple of things before I start. The first is that I am really aware that I'm speaking as a white Welshman in this conversation. And given that, I'm really open to criticism of any blind spots that I might have, especially from Black people and people of colour. The second thing that I want to say is that at some point in this talk, I will be discussing some distressing material relating to the history of slavery. I know that this can be quite a traumatic thing to discuss, so I'm going to try and give warning when that kind of material is going to come up, so that people can opt in or opt out of it and come back into the talk when I finished dealing with that kind of material. So with that done, I am going to get talking. So the Gorsedd stones in Carmarthen Park, which are in the middle of the slide here, were put up in 1973 in preparation for the 1974 National Eisteddfod. Their seeds, however, were planted over 150 years earlier, when a 72-year-old former stonemason called Edward Williams, better known by his bardic name Iolo Morgannwg, laid out a much more modest circle of rocks in the garden of the Ivy Bush Hotel. That occasion was another Eisteddfod, the Carmarthen Eisteddfod of 1819, which would be the very first time that a Gorsedd circle would become part of this famous Welsh institution. According to Iolo, the Gorsedd was an ancient tradition passed down to him through generations from the time of the ancient Druids. But actually, as some of you I'm sure know, he'd invented it himself about 30 years earlier, infusing it with his own pro-equality and anti-war opinions. Bards being admitted to the Gorsedd circle had to draw a sword held by Iolo, which is the same sword that's on the slide now in the National Museum of Wales. But in drawing out this sword, They had to vow never to do violence, and the event's climax was a ceremonial sheathing of the sword by the assembled bards, symbolising the institution's commitment to peace. According to Iolo, the foundations of the gorsedd were universal peace and perfect equality, that's a quote from him, reflecting his opposition to imperialist wars, his detestation of aristocratic power, and to some extent his long-term opposition to the extreme inequalities of slavery. In all this, you could say that the gorsedd stones are the polar opposite of that other great stone monument in Carmarthen, the memorial obelisk to Sir Thomas Picton, Knight of the Bath, fighter of Britain's imperial wars and brutal colonial enslaver. There is, however, another story that can be told about Iolo's gorsedd stones, which undermines their apparent dedication to peace, equality, and liberty, and ties them to the more disturbing and unnerving histories that Picton's monument has come to represent. Because Picton was inescapably present at the Eisteddfod of 1819, not in person, he died 4 years earlier, but nevertheless central to the proceedings, a famous local boy and a focus of regional and national pride. Thomas Picton's brother, the Reverend Edward Picton, who had inherited ownership of the many enslaved people on Picton's plantation in Trinidad, was a prominent member of the 1819 Eisteddfod's managing committee. The most prestigious prize on offer, the Bardic Chair, was awarded for a memorial poem on the death of Sir Thomas Picton. There were entries from bards across Wales singing Picton's praises, and one of the judges of these militaristic outpourings was Iolo Morgannwg himself. And the image on the slide is actually the silver prize that was given to the chair-winning bard at the same Eisteddfod where the gorsedd was introduced to the Eisteddfod for the poem about Sir Thomas Picton. And the man who carried the sword in Iolo's gorsedd that I showed you before was Iolo's poetic protege, Gwilym Morgannwg, who saw fit to praise not only Picton's recent campaigns against Napoleon in Europe in his Eisteddfod poem, but also specifically the bloody periods Picton spent as a colonial governor in Trinidad. So this is Gwilym Morgannwg's poem. A'r gŵr glew i'r gorllewin, trwy glod trallod i'w trin, cadwodd ei glod hynodwyw, twyllwyr, bradwyr, a brew. The translation, the brave man, that is Picton, went to the West Indies to treat it honourably despite hardships. He maintained his exceptional honour despite tricksters, traitors, and suffering. The tricksters and traitors referred to here in this Welsh Eisteddfod poem were the people appalled by Picton's method of government, which included execution without trial, torture, literal witch hunts, summary imprisonment, maiming, and the securing and extension of slavery. It was these so-called traitors who reported Picton's behaviour and brought him to trial, where he escaped punishment only thanks to a legal technicality. At a gorsedd and an Eisteddfod dedicated to peace and equality, you'd assume it would be their example, the people who handed him into the authorities, that would be hailed as heroic. But instead, it was the enslaver General Picton who was the object of bardic praise. For some people across Britain, and perhaps especially in Wales, the last year might have felt a little like going from my first interpretation of the gorsedd stones in this talk, comforting, flattering to modern morality, perhaps patriotic or heroic, to my second interpretation, in which the disturbing facts of British racist and colonial history filter back into our understanding of who we are and where we're from. This, I hasten to add, hasn't been true for everyone. Many activists, historians, and people of colour have been aware of these issues for a long time. But for a lot of white Welsh people, objects and places that have been familiar or ignored for years have suddenly been thrust into an uncomfortably bright spotlight, made unignorable by a global wave of protest and direct action. Even for me, someone who studies a very relevant period in Welsh culture, there have been surprises. I already knew, for instance, about General Picton's misdeeds and about the ambiguities that undermine Iolo Morgannwg's reputation for anti-slavery. But General William Nott's imperial record in Afghanistan was new to me. The name Nott Square had always just been a completely neutral label in my mind, a name for the place we passed through for my mum to get a haircut, where we attended school events and local eisteddfodau in St. Peter's Hall. Now, however, I can't forget that its namesake, William Nott, though apparently not the worst general in Britain's first Afghan war, still succeeded, according to one of his own officers in, and I'm quoting from a primary source here, leaving one of the most beautiful valleys in Afghanistan a scene of desolation. Part of the reason that this kind of thing comes as a surprise, I think, is that when I was growing up, I heard very little about the role Wales and Britain played in slavery and in the British Empire. Going to school in Carmarthen, I studied history right through until sixth form and learned in detail about racism in civil rights era America and racism in apartheid South Africa. But I heard little about how British imperialism was fundamental to both those subjects. American racial history is, of course, a long-term consequence of British colonial enslavement, and South African apartheid grew on the foundations of British imperialism. But it was difficult not to gain the impression in these history lessons that anti-Blackness was an over-there issue, not part of our national inheritance. Also, in Welsh medium education throughout my childhood, it was easy to get the sense that the more imperialist parts of British history didn't really apply to me. They seemed to be associated with the same England-centric oppressions that had resulted in the loss of Welsh self-rule and the decline of the Welsh language. That the conquest and marginalisation of Wales did not stop Welsh people from engaging in imperialism overseas was not a truth that was often told to us. Things have changed since then, of course, and are about to change even more with the new recommendations being introduced by the Welsh Government in 2022, which will make the teaching of Black, Asian and minority ethnic histories compulsory in Welsh schools. However, I couldn't help but think of my previous lack of knowledge last year when the issue of Thomas Picton's memorial in Carmarthen was raised during that summer's Black Lives Matter protests. Now, in one sense, I completely understand the plan decided on by Carmarthenshire County Council, who are basing much of their decision about the fate of Picton's monument on an online public consultation. Ideally, it makes sense that this kind of decision should be made collectively by the people of Carmarthen. However, alongside worries about whether or not far-right campaigns would try to skew the results, I felt very aware of the fact that information about Picton and about wider Welsh involvement in slavery and empire would not necessarily be widely known amongst the generation I went to school with. And I only know this stuff because I happen to become a historian of this period, or a historian of the culture of this period. Even during the explosion of articles about Picton and his memorials in June 2020, the information publicly available about him was often limited. And I was only able to flesh it out myself because I had access to scholarly resources through my university. When the results of the public consultation came out in November, around 60% of respondents who said that they were from Carmarthenshire indicated that they thought no changes needed to be made to the Picton monument, a result which has been cited by the council in their decision to merely add information boards nearby that will highlight Picton and other aspects of local history. Now, I don't imagine that everyone who responded to that poll will change their minds whatever I have to say about it tonight. But for the next part of this talk, I do want to respond to some of the points raised by the public consultation and present some underreported historical information that might, if it was more widely known, have led some people to reconsider their opinions. So firstly, there are the 137 respondents who argued against any change because, quote, the focus of the monument is military recognition. Without additional information, this does seem to make a lot of sense. The memorial in its current form lists the names of famous battles in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars and makes no explicit mention of Picton's time as a governor in Trinidad. However, this isn't the whole story. First of all, it's worth noting that if anyone sees this memorial as a tribute to ordinary soldiers and military families, This is really complicated by the fact that one of the controversies surrounding Thomas Picton in his time was his shocking treatment of the men under his command. In Trinidad, for instance, one of the charges against him was that he illegally executed a soldier without trial or court-martial, and he was known for handing out exceptionally severe punishments, including floggings of 1,500 lashes that endangered soldiers' lives. With this information, it's difficult to think, I believe, of Picton's monument as a tribute to the ordinary soldiers who are at risk during wars. Secondly, just because monuments to Picton don't mention Trinidad and slavery, it doesn't mean that they weren't put up with those precise things in mind. When the first memorial to Picton was erected in Carmarthen, his time as Trinidad's governor and the controversy surrounding his tenure there was very much public knowledge. I've already quoted poetry from the 1819 Eisteddfod making reference to it, but even more significantly, when a ceremony was held in 1825 celebrating the laying of the memorial's foundation stone, the Glamorganshire MP and naval officer Sir Christopher Cole gave an address that explicitly linked the Carmarthen monument with efforts to exonerate Picton's colonial reputation. And the picture on the slide is the original version of the Picton monument that didn't survive because it wasn't very well built. And I think maybe that should have been taken as an omen and they shouldn't have put up another one, but whatever. So this is the address at the setting of the memorial stone, of the foundation stone of the first memorial. Sir Christopher Cole said, "I had frequent opportunities in Trinidad of witnessing the activity, ability, and rigid principle which marked Picton's conduct in this high station. Gentlemen, if these were my feelings, it was with a degree of disgust that I will not attempt to describe that I found by the public prince a violent persecution of this honest and upright public servant." Once again, the violent persecution mentioned here is the attempt to bring Picton to trial in London for his crimes in Trinidad, including the torture of the teenager Louisa Calderon, an act that he admitted and for which he was found guilty by a jury before escaping eventual punishment. This contemporary address suggests, therefore, that the monument to Picton in Carmarthen was intended as a direct rebuke to those who would try to hold Picton to account. The monument is, as respondents to the council survey assumed, an act of military recognition, but that recognition was a deliberate attempt to cover up the colonial scandals that had stained Picton's career. The monument is explicitly about Picton the general, but implicitly it's an endorsement of Picton the enslaver. So these examples bring us to the next point that was raised by the council's consultation that I want to address, which is the 74 respondents who argue that no change should be made to the monument because, quote, Picton was a figure of his time. Now, at one level, again, this is undoubtedly true. Picton lived at a time when slavery remained legal in the British Empire, and many other Britons were enslavers at that time. But this argument also obscures an awful lot. As I've hopefully already made clear, Picton's fellow Britons did not see him as a typical man of his time. In fact, his cruelty stood out enough that it was not some radical journalist who investigated and reported his activities in Trinidad, but rather his successor in governing the island for Britain, a Scottish imperial soldier named Colonel William Fullerton. It's also significant that when Picton purchased the enslaved people who worked his plantations, abolition of the slave trade was being openly discussed by members of the British Parliament, and anti-slavery was becoming a major political movement. Plenty of people in Picton's era were arguing that slavery was immoral, cruel, and oppressive, but Picton chose to become an enslaver despite this in order to enrich himself. Being a man of his time didn't mean that Picton didn't have a choice. Now, lastly, I'd like to address the large number of respondents, 483, who said that there should be no changes made to the Picton monument because, quote, you cannot change or erase history. This is another of those phrases that initially makes perfect common sense. Of course, you can't change what happened in the past. However, history isn't exactly what happened in the past. Instead, it's the stories that we choose to tell ourselves about that past. And those stories are things that change all the time. As we find out new information, they change as we think up important ways of framing old material, and they change as we discover that our present moment requires us to search for different kinds of historical meaning. Therefore, we actually can and often should change history, because otherwise we'd be dependent on the partial and incomplete ways of understanding the past handed down to us by previous generations. And in that spirit, I'd like to suggest that we change a particular historical phrase that has become routinely attached to men like Picton, and which is also, incidentally, used about him in the Council's report on the monument. So on the bottom of this slide, we have the Council's Task and Finish group group's recommendations about changes to be made to the monument, in which information boards are going to be put up by the monument and by the painting in the Guildhall. And also on point 4, it stated that any information boards should reference the local history of the area and also the history of Sir Thomas Picton, encompassing his military career, as well as, and the phrase I've highlighted, his known links with slavery. Now, this phrase, his links with slavery, is used again and again about Picton, and I'm not trying to attack the authors of the report, who probably just selected a familiar and easy phrase that was being used a lot about Picton. However, as someone who studies this period, I think that it's a phrase that severely downplays Picton's deep and disturbingly enthusiastic immersion in slavery. Iolo Morgannwg, the creator of the Gorsedd stones, is someone who I describe as having links with slavery. His brothers were enslavers who owned plantations in Jamaica, and in 1815 he inherited a significant amount of money from them. Picton, however, was much, much more than that. And this is where some of the material is starting to, some of the more distressing material in the talk is going to start coming out. So these are Picton's, quote, links to slavery. Firstly, during Picton's governorship of Trinidad, the enslaved population of the island approximately doubled. He didn't just maintain slavery there, he oversaw its extension. After his arrival on the island, he first began making money from a business that captured those who had escaped enslavement and returned them to their plantations. He soon bought his own plantations, along with large numbers of enslaved people, whom he branded with his initial, P, and from whom he made substantial personal profits. He oversaw the publication of a new so-called slave code for British Trinidad that set out the punishments that unfree Black people would face. At the prison in Trinidad's capital, he allowed the routine maiming and flogging of enslaved inmates. And most damningly, possibly, he empowered paranoid local plantation owners to run an investigation into a spate of supposed poisonings, which resulted in a literal witch hunt, one that killed and persecuted enslaved people suspected of performing certain ritual practices. The torture and punishment given to enslaved suspects in these investigations was terrible, designed to frighten the rest of the enslaved population into compliance. And the following, for instance, is a letter from a British doctor in Trinidad in 1802, who describes details of what happened to condemned enslaved people under Picton's rule, a letter that's now kept in the British Library. And now I want to give a slightly more serious content warning. This letter is a particularly violent and disturbing one. If you want to turn off your computer's sound for a little to skip this part, I will pause a little before I start reading, and I will raise my hand after I finish reading it. So here's the letter from a doctor on Trinidad under Picton in 1802, referring to prisoners who were caught up in his trials. First day, the condemned enslaved people were hung till nearly dead, then taken down and their heads cut off, their bodies burnt and their heads fixed on poles and stuck up in every direction at the roadside. I never ride out without seeing them. It is astonishing with what fortitude they suffer. They never betray the least fear under the gallows or make the least noise or even wry face, but always meet their fate with a most determined resolution. thought a lot about whether to include these details in this talk. I'm very aware of how a lot of Black people have spoken about how traumatizing the increased sharing of this kind of material can be. And I'm open to criticism that I've made a misjudgment here. But I decided to include it because I genuinely think that the phrase Picton's links to slavery has obscured the extent to which Picton did not just have a passive and distant association with that institution. In fact, he was personally responsible for some of its most monstrous and horrifying practices. And the conversation about him in Carmarthen and elsewhere, in my opinion, should fully reflect the horror of what Picton did. So what's to be done about him? So as you might have guessed, there's part of me that wants to remove Picton and everything associated with him from our public spaces. However, I'm very mindful of what Mohamed said in her excellent talk for this project, which you should definitely go back and watch for yourselves on YouTube if you haven't yet. According to her, if all we do now is immediately scrap these monuments, we lose, quote, a chance to reflect, to respect, and to learn from them. I also want to acknowledge that this can't be all about public art, even if it's interesting to me. As Professor Olivette Otele, Britain's first Black female history professor, has said, and I'm quoting her here, racism, discrimination, all these things will carry on after the statues have been removed. That's one reason why I've decided to donate my speaking fee for this talk to Race Council Cymru and their Black Lives Matter Wales campaign, as they're doing more than I can to address issues in Wales that have more to do with the present than with the past. However, what I can do as someone who specialises in Welsh culture and history is to suggest some alternative histories in Carmarthen that might be useful if we want to reflect, respect and learn from the past represented by Picton and those he harmed. One thing I do find surprising is how little commemoration we have in Carmarthen of what are probably the first original anti-slavery publications in the Welsh language, printed here in around 1792. So this song that I've got on the right-hand side of the slide here was entitled Achwynion Dynion Dion mewn Caethiwed Triennis yn Ynysoedd y Sugar, or in English, The Complaints of Black Men in Wretched Slavery in the Sugar Islands. And it urged Welsh people to realise that sugar produced in the West Indies was the product of an oppressive and immoral institution. Gwrandewch Britanniad Mwynion a Chwynion Dynion Di, sy'n goddef blin gaethiwed gwaini o'ch plegyd chwi. Listen, dear Welsh Britons, to the black men's complaints, who suffer harsh enslavement. Shame on us for your benefit. So this song was printed by Iwan Daniel in King Street and was almost certainly written by Morgan John Rhys, a Glamorgan Baptist radical, who also wrote an anti-slavery pamphlet for the same Carmarthen publisher, and that pamphlet is the other image on the screen. Highlighting the publication of these abolitionist texts in Carmarthen is useful in the context of Picton, because it proves the extent to which Picton's cruel, oppressive, and self-interested involvement in slavery was not the only position available to a white Welsh person. Just like Picton, Morgan John Rhys was a man of his time, but rather than profiting from slavery, he tried to educate the Welsh-speaking population about slavery's evils. However, when we're remembering slavery, we do have to be careful, I think, not to focus too much on white abolitionists. Admirable as many of them may have been, we shouldn't just replace one narrative of white heroism represented by Picton with a different narrative of white heroism represented by Morgan John Rhys. The pitfalls of this approach are most obvious when it comes to someone like Iolo Morgannwg, who, yes, spoke out against slavery, but also as a white British man, was able to benefit financially from the institution by inheriting money from his brothers in Jamaica. In terms of Carmarthen's history, one way around this problem is to highlight an abolitionist who visited the town in the 1840s, but who was not white. This is the black anti-slavery lecturer and campaigner Moses Roper. So Roper was born into slavery in North Carolina in around 1815, but he managed to escape and start a new life in Britain in the 1830s, where he attended University College London and published an abolitionist autobiography describing the horrors of American slavery. After this book's publication, he started an astounding UK-wide speaking tour, visiting town halls and places of worship across the country, including countless smaller rural audiences, including in Wales and in Carmarthenshire. Roper spoke in Llansteffan, in Llangendeirn, in Meidrim, Talog and Llangenech. And on April 26th, 1841, he spoke to a, quote, large number of persons in Carmarthen's town hall, who found his lecture most painfully interesting, according to the newspapers, and used the occasion to denounce pro-slavery Christians in the United States, and also some ex-abolitionists in Wales who had started to lose their enthusiasm. Highlighting Black abolitionists like Roper demonstrates, firstly, that Black people were active in their own emancipation, and secondly, that there is Black history in Carmarthen and Carmarthenshire that goes back further than many of its white residents might assume. These are just some of the local histories I would like to see highlighted alongside depictions. This could perhaps happen within the information boards the council has promised, which will apparently also highlight other aspects of local history, and which I hope won't therefore bury information about Carmarthen's difficult legacies of imperialism and slavery within a familiar narrative of Rebecca Rioters, Eisteddfodau, and so on, despite the fact that those things are also important. However, if that doesn't happen, these histories should instead become part of the more engaged and collaborative ways of remembering that seem to be springing up in the wake of projects like this one, which has been for me a genuinely exciting communal experience and has helped me see a town in which I grew up in a new light. What we mustn't do is let the uncomfortable things we've learnt about ourselves slide into the background once more without doing any further work. We shouldn't just move on and forget what's been brought up since summer 2020, nor react to it, as British and Welsh culture often has, by creating a flattering narrative about abolition and anti-imperialism that covers up the lessons we need to learn first from slavery and imperialism themselves. Something that I've come across in a few discussions during this project's breakout rooms has been a collective desire to disassociate ourselves from monumental imperialists like Picton, an urge to paint them as oppressive aristocrats, fundamentally different from the ordinary Welsh people we might be more likely to identify ourselves with. But although this can be part of the truth, it's not the whole truth. The Eisteddfod poem that I quoted at the beginning of this talk, which attacked the traitors and the tricksters who tried to bring Picton to justice, was written by Gwilym Morgannwg, a Welsh pub landlord who started his working life at the age of 7 mining coal in Merthyr Tydfil, or near Merthyr Tydfil. Another competitor at that Eisteddfod, Ieuan Glangarionydd, who wrote of the brutal Picton, Tirion ydoedd ef yn Trinidad, he was gentle in Trinidad, was a day school teacher who had grown up in a struggling farming family. These were relatively ordinary Welsh people, some of whom had had difficult lives, but they still participated in a culture of praise that built up around this cruel enslaver, in part because Eisteddfodau offered a means of social climbing, but also because a number of Welsh people, a relatively wide range of them, were genuinely convinced by this culture that Picton was a kind of hero. We have a responsibility to look back at that culture, see that it's part of our common heritage, and learn the lessons that might teach us about how we deal with power and injustice today. So finally, I'm just going to end with a bit of a jump in time and a picture of the most recent artwork in Carmarthen that this project has been investigating, the bronze plaque to Gwynfor Evans in Guildhall Square. Put up to celebrate his success in the Carmarthen by-election of 1966. So Gwynfor Evans, the first ever Plaid Cymru MP, was in many ways an inheritor of the most admirable aspects of Iolo Morgannwg's gorsedd. An anti-imperialist and committed pacifist, he hoped for a world in which the worst aspects of European imperialism would be dismantled, and war heroes like Picton would no longer be required. The celebrating crowd depicted on this plaque is a kind of symbol of that hopeful vision. However, the genuine historical picture that the plaque is based on is slightly different. It's an image that was not taken in Guildhall Square in 1966, but in Knott Square in 1974. And if you look closely in the background, where I've put a red highlighted circle, you can see the shadowy form of Imperial British General and Despoiler of Afghanistan, William Knott, emerging from the crowd behind Evans. To me, this is a useful reminder of the extent to which we cannot yet totally escape the darker parts of our history. We might want to reach something like the cheering crowd in the Guildhall plaque, but we still have to deal somehow with the shadow of the imperialist statue that the picture it was based on reveals. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rhys. That was fantastic. Really brilliant, so rich. So much in there. Like my mind's going. I can't talk. But yeah, really, really fantastic. I think it really brought out the importance of language and how when we use language like links with slavery, it has a very sort of almost subliminal effect on how you view that person, and suddenly they become less brutal. So that was really good, and thank you for being so good with your trigger warnings. That's really great. I really appreciate that. Also, I think just painting the complexity of the picture, it's, you know, it is really complex, and you know, someone like Iolo Morgannwg, we can't say he was all good and, you know, all light and you know, an anti-slavery campaigner, because he wasn't. There was, you know, there were other sides. So yeah, that was really interesting, fascinating about the anti-slavery publications. Didn't know about that. And the Moses Roper and the speaking tour. Those are wonderful pieces of history. And I think I made quite a few notes on what you said, but one of the things I wrote down is about learning the lesson of how we deal with power and injustice today. And I think that is really key. That is a really key thing. It is not just about getting entangled in history. It is also about what we can learn from that history in order to go forward. So note down any questions that you have for Rhys. I can see those comments in the chat. I think those are appreciative comments for you, Rhys, so have a look at them. But if you have any questions, put them in the chat. We're going to have a break now, and we will come back at 8. That gives us just over 10 minutes. So we'll come back at 8 p.m. and we will hear from Molara. Okay, diolch yn fawr pawb. See you in 10 minutes. Oh, croeso nôl, welcome back. I hope everyone's had a nice break and rested their eyes, stretched their legs, done whatever they needed to do. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker tonight, and I'm very happy to be introducing a dear friend of mine. We've known each other for many years. Molara Awen is a singer, songwriter, teacher and performer. She founded the One Voice Choir in 2005, co-founded Narberth A Cappella Voice Festival in 2008, and is a trustee of the Natural Voice Network. She has delivered music, arts and education to children and young people since 1992. And has campaigned for racial, economic and social equality all her life. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Molara Awen.
Helo, shwmae pawb. Dwi'n gobeithio mae pawb yn iawn. I hope everybody's feeling fine and enjoying the talk so far. I am going to go off at a tangent to start with, but bear with me. I've got a little PowerPoint that I am just going to share with you now. Hopefully you can all see that. Why African connections?
Molara, sorry, I can't see that. I don't know about anyone else.
Oh.
No, we can't see that.
Oh. Hang on 1 second. Let me just, there we go. That's what it is. There was one more step. Is it sharing now? Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see something. Yeah.
Okay. You can see a monkey.
Yeah.
Can you see the whole PowerPoint though? Is it filling your screen?
No, it's not filling the screen. We can see a few other bits as well.
Beautiful. Is it now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Beautiful. The joys of technology. If we were in real life, I could stand and talk to you easily. So yeah, African connections. While I was growing up in school, it was completely devoid of anything related to Black history, Black culture, nothing like that. We had one teacher during a geography lesson who began a sentence when I'd asked a question about in our country, Molara, as in it was everybody else in the class's country, but not mine. And a history teacher during one history lesson said that Gustavus Adolphus was the nigger in the woodpile of the 30 Years' War, and then froze, looked at me and went, "Oh my God, I'm really sorry," making the whole thing 10 times worse than the fact that he just used that as a phrase that one might use in a history lesson. The reason that I'm showing you these two images now, one is from the Kingdom of Kush, which was in 1070 BC in East Africa. One is an Axumite obelisk from 80 BC, the Kingdom of Axum. Very sophisticated cultures, because mankind, as we all know, all of the earliest human remains were found in Africa. But we hear about Egypt. We hear about Egypt sort of divorced from Africa, excuse me, and we hear very little of sub-Saharan Africa, other than that it was primitive, that everybody was backward, that we were all running around being jungle bunnies, which is another thing which I've had said to me in my life. But clearly the origins of man, and if we look at the original people from the original Australians, the original Asians, there's a theme there. The people are people of colour. So the original people on the planet are people of colour. And my point is, African history is all of our history, because if that's where mankind started, that's where we should be. Art, culture, language, music, there is such a richness from the continent of Africa that I feel like we're actually denying ourselves something by denying ourselves that connection, and only starting the history of Black people when they started to be sold as slaves. We hear a lot of that in history, but very little else. For those of you that don't know, although this continent of poverty-stricken people were considered to be of little note, in 1894 in Berlin, the Berlin Conference, the whole continent was divvied up by Europeans. And I don't know if you can read the slide, but basically I've travelled across the length and breadth of Africa. I've not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I've seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such calibre. I do not think we could ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, her spiritual and cultural heritage. And from my perspective, it's only really last year that we have acknowledged that this is what's happened to the continent of Africa, while countries still continue to help themselves to the gold, to the diamond, to the coffee, to the cotton, to the iron, etc., etc. So yeah, there was nothing in geography, history, culture, TV. There was nobody on TV who was Black when I was growing up. They were all pimps or criminals. If you look at the picture on the right, that's the original Ghanaian independent government, and these are government ministers of today. Personally, I'd be more down with the outfits on the right, but that's just personal opinion. Cultural appropriation, Elvis singing what was essentially black music and making millions. There are countless stories of black musicians basically having their songs recorded by white musicians and then going on to be hits. I don't know if any of you have watched recently, there's a brilliant film, Ma Rainey's Black Box, is it? Yeah. And then Bo Derek, when I was growing up, we were all ridiculed for having cornrow hair with beads in, and then all of a sudden Bo Derek, a white woman, had cornrow hair, and it was all of the rage, and loads of my white girlfriends were going around with cornrow hair. Kim Kardashian's backside depicted there. I've been ridiculed all my life for the size and shape of my backside, but now that Kim Kardashian has got a big backside, everybody's having all of their cellulite pumped into their bottom, and various other horrible chemicals. Again, once white people take something that is black, then it's allowed to kind of come into existence. Black History 365. We talk about some of these events as if they were very much in the distant past, but 200 years ago in America, black people were not allowed to learn to read. 200 years ago in America, it was legal to flog a black person to death. Slave owners were compensated for the loss of their slaves. But if you look what happened to the slaves themselves, very few of them got the land that they were promised. Very few of them got any financial recompense. And 100 years ago, white people were trashing black businesses in America because, you know, they didn't want to see, they couldn't cope with the idea that black people could become independent, basically, and kind of develop that self-worth. And as I say, our lives did not start with slavery, and I think it's time now, if we're talking about history, that we talk about all of our history and all of the aspects of our history and the richness that black culture and black people have brought to the planet. I would say back to Africa, this photo there of this blue-eyed white girl is my daughter. She's a quarter African. So if she can be a quarter African, why do we separate ourselves as black and white? Black Lives Matter. Do we believe in equality? All lives matter, I've had said to me so many times. Yes, we know that. We just would like our lives to matter as much as everybody else's. And it doesn't feel like that. We are constantly compared to monkeys and monkey chants this and that. However, we have very small ears. And if you see this chimpanzee has got very big ears, we have got very full lips. And you might notice that the chimpanzee's got very thin lips. We generally have almondy shaped eyes, and that chimpanzee has very round eyes. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. That's just a little bit about kind of my history, my philosophy, what I believe in. And before Christmas, one thing I have to say, I really praise the Welsh Government for the work that they're doing currently. They commissioned Race Council Cymru before Christmas to canvass opinion of different black and minority ethnic and Asian people across Wales to find out what their lived experiences were. And what I'm going to read to you next is a few quotes from people. The question is, what is your experience of education and at what levels, school, university, training courses? I witnessed a lot of racism from teachers and from pupils. I've never spoken to a black person before. Oh, you're a Paki and you smell of curry. And a lot of people experienced institutionalized racism within schools. This is a quote from a student 6 weeks before Christmas in a local comprehensive school here in Pembrokeshire, from a white pupil to a mixed race student. Black children are starving in Africa and all Black people should be slaves. Ignorant jokes. I have a lovely young lady that I teach singing to, who has Afro hair. She's been told she needs to tie her hair back in school by teachers, and some of the students have called her Bush. This is all information from the last 6 months, by the way. Some of this it goes historical. One pupil was segregated and isolated due to the will of teachers and other parents. Following 9/11, a lot of Muslim students have found a great increase in abuse, called suicide bomber, if they're wearing a backpack, telling other students to be wary of them. And a quote that one person I interviewed said was, "We have to deal with what we have to deal with." And there's sort of been an acceptance in Black people that this is just what we put up with and what we have to go through. Next question. Can you tell us about the barriers, difficulties you or your children or family faced? Many people said that they felt more under pressure to achieve and constantly suffered microaggressions and referrals to them as if they were not going to be quite up to par as some of their white counterparts were. Some people say there were no systems in place to deal with racism and no Black history whatsoever. One student said she was informed by a drama teacher that she would never be able to be an actor. She would only be a drama teacher herself. And I don't know if any of you saw the Black and Welsh programme, one young man who wanted to become a lawyer was laughed at by his careers advisor and told that he would never become a lawyer, which he has now become. Yes, terrorist, jokes about being Muslim, bombs with duffel bags, abuse around the Black Lives Matter from last year. Because I am Black, they can recreate whipping with a tie and say the word nigger. It's challenging for me as a mother. Why did my son have to be the mature one and rise above the abuse when other students who were abusing him didn't get the discipline? There's a put up and shut up. A lot of people said that the school was dependent on the head teacher, how the head teacher behaved. My own daughter, who's now 18, one of her teachers in school said, the coloured people. And my daughter said, people don't like to be referred to as coloured people. And the teacher told her off and said they like to be referred to as coloured people, and told her that she was in the wrong. Another example was, I came back from work one day and she had a full computer full of swastikas. And I said, what are you doing? And the history teacher had said it was okay to put a swastika on your history book as a symbol of the Second World War. Now, I was on the school first thing the next morning, and anybody who had done that had their book taken away and got given a new book. But my point is, this is what we are having to experience as Black people in modern society. When the Brexit campaign came about, my children's friends told them that they and I were going to be deported. And we're constantly, as Black people, told by teachers just to ignore it and to get on with our lives. Where are we up to? I'm just going to move on to some of the conversations with people about the police, basically, because that's also another challenging area for people. Hang on, I'm just scrolling through the documents here. Sorry, I've lost myself. Teachers, education. Sorry, I should have had some music to play in the background. Racist words come from homes, is one of the concerns, and from parents, and all establishments, whether they be schools, whether they be the police force, whoever they are, they need to be able to find ways to be able to deal with these things, rather than students having to, Black and minority ethnic and Asian students having to take those things on board. I'm going to go to employment and income next first, because there are some important things that were said about that. People have found that on the phone it's okay, but when they turn up for interviews, some people say, oh, I didn't expect, or you don't sound. Somebody who works at Withybush Hospital with 2 Caucasian counterparts finds that if patients are given a choice, he's called Mohammed, they will generally choose one of the other 2 people to work with, even though he's equally qualified as they are. People are always shocked when a Black or minority ethnic person speaks Welsh, fi hefyd, and people have made comments recently such as, what's it like being in civilization? And a Black family pulled up, this is going back to last year. One of my friends works in a like a car wash, and a Black family pulled up in a car, I think, tourists, and he, as they pulled up, one of his co-workers said, all Black people are good for is pulling donkeys. So yeah, issues with names, comments such as, what do we call you now, Mrs. Bame, have been said around the whole Black Lives Matter. And people feeling that there's nobody at senior level who reflects them, and you need to see people who look like you to feel appreciated and represented. As a strong female, being Black makes it that bit more difficult. I find it difficult to hold my space, and I have to be subservient to people all the time to be freely myself, because otherwise I get accused of being intimidating. And everywhere I've worked, I've been the only person of colour. Housing situation has generally been good for people, but some people have been denied council houses and denied housing benefit, and they have, for example, their wages deliberately distorted, and having people say things like, oh, well, tough luck, and hanging up the phone. So there are a few negative instances. People coming from Windrush generation, like my dad, was told he needed a biometric card to work, having worked here all of his life. He was forced to sell his house and go to live in Birmingham with family. As a Muslim woman, there's a lot of racism towards us. Often, if you have people who are vulnerable, women who've been abused, they might be put onto an estate where they are the only people of colour, and then obviously feel very vulnerable, very exposed, and very track downable by their ex-partners. Crime and criminal justice. My parents came to visit. A woman stopped and followed us in the street, came to my house, and when I opened the door, she said, "Who do you think you are, and what are you doing in this country?" This is to somebody who's lived in Pembrokeshire for 30 years. And this is going back a couple of years. "You're not welcome, go back where you came from." I personally came from Manchester. Age 14, I slapped a girl who racially abused me. She reported it to the police. I was interviewed and cautioned by the police aged 16, 2 years later, and she had no repercussions. My 5-year-old daughter was abused and called Osama bin Laden outside school. My car has been damaged. Police have stopped me, And if I'm the only black kid, I'm the only person that they'll question. I was stopped 17 times in 3 years in different vehicles in Milford Haven, and I was stopped once for running down the street. So I could kind of go on. There are so many instances of people suffering microaggressions, racist abuse. Some of these go back 40 years ago, some of them go back 30, some of them goes back 20, some of them 10, some of them 2 months ago. So you can see there's a theme here emerging for people not trusting the police because they cannot be confident that they are going to be treated in the same way as other people who have called the police because they've been abused and then ended up getting arrested themselves. So yeah, that's just some quotes, and that's some work that we've been doing for the Welsh Government's Race Equality Action Plan, which should come into effect next month. So I also know, dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg, dwi wedi dysgu Cymraeg, I learned Welsh achos dwi'n byw yng Nghymru, a dwi'n meddwl mae'n galed iawn I dysgu, it's very hard to learn, but it's very important to me to be here in this culture and to show my respect to that culture and my appreciation to be lucky enough to live here in Wales. And particularly knowing what has happened in Welsh history, the Welsh not, having your culture and your language taken away from you effectively. So in a way, I kind of think there's different strands in Wales, as we saw from Rhys's talk, different strands about people fighting for equality and justice and knowing exactly what that feels like. And then other people who don't necessarily feel the same way. I think to say that somebody is a figure of time, I get this in my work as well, told that certain people are of their time, as if that in some way is acceptable. I think what we need to have now is a history which celebrates all voices. It's not hiding the past. I know a lot of the debate around the taking down of the statues was that we would be hiding history. I actually think that those people who were the heroes were hiding history because they were venerated and celebrated as opening schools. We named a school after Sir Thomas Picton, who was taken to court by the British government for his torture and abuse of a 14-year-old girl. And yet we named schools after him. And he didn't get off because he didn't torture the 14-year-old girl. He got off because he said, well, the Spanish were here first and they did torture. So I was just doing what they did. So it's a very complex thing because we're not saying we're going to hide that past, but they have hidden past. It's been their voice in history. It's not been anybody else. It's not been the voices of the people who they whipped and flogged and tortured. It's only been their voices saying, aren't I brilliant? And I've made lots of money so I can support my white community whilst I flog and trash and behead black people and enslave them and make money. So let's have a history that talks about everybody. You know, I went into a pub aged 16, I think, in North Wales, and it still had a sign up that said no wogs or dogs. And as a self-respecting black person, I have issues with that, obviously. I'm very glad Rhys included the letter as well, because let's talk about that, because that's what we need to say. We can't just say, oh, you know, well, black people have got to get over it. We're sick of getting over it. We're sick of being the ones who have to educate, who have to put up and shut up. I don't want to walk down the street and have to see people celebrated. I love the music of Michael Jackson, but there's no way that I'd put up a statue of Michael Jackson because we know what we know about Michael Jackson. I watched Jim Will Fix It as a youth, but there's no way we're keeping up statues of Jimmy Savile and saying to the victims of abuse, you know, oh, you just have to get over it. I appreciate more time has passed, but the culture that we live in has not really changed massively in terms of the lived experience of Black people. I've had it said to me the year before last, Blacks never had it so good. I have been spat at, I have been pushed, I've been talked down to, I've been told that all lives matter, as I said previously. I know that we do. And the most traumatic experience for me was that in 2010, my 23-year-old cousin was restrained to death by 11 police officers in a London hospital, having committed no crime. He had a mental health crisis. We took him to hospital, the best place, and he was restrained to death by 11 police officers. They took it in turns. They handcuffed him across his face. They put him in 2 sets of leg restraints. They talked about the head end. And he was treated no better than a dog. Actually, he was treated worse than a dog. And now we fought 7 years to get an inquest, and the inquest independent jury found in 2017 that the police had caused his death. The police held an inquiry and there was no case to answer. So the officers that restrained him to death are still working. I appreciate that that wasn't in Wales, but in this year, 2021, Moyed Bashir, Mahmoud Hassan have both died in very suspicious circumstances at the hands of the police in Newport and in Cardiff. So these issues are not going away. These issues, we might like to say they're historical issues and say, you know, or we all just have to get on with it. But actually, that's not acceptable anymore. It's not acceptable in 2021. We now are, I'm speaking at the All Wales People First conference with Welsh Government ministers to have the law, which is named after my cousin Shenny's law, brought about here in Wales, which means that any police officer has to wear a body cam if they're going into, particularly into a mental health setting, because not only did they kill him, but then when he was lying there dead, they said that he was feigning unconsciousness. So by the time that they did actually get to him, it was too late. He was brain dead. So juxtapose this with the language that some of the people, some of the young people in Pembrokeshire are happy to use. My daughter is doing an online college course at the minute, and one of her fellow students called one of his white friends during, he was gaming, during the online session, called his friend a nigger as a term of abuse. And a lot of the young people, particularly up at Ysgol Preseli, say things like, wagwan pif ting. They're all there talking in patois and being cool, but yet they're coming out with comments such as, you know, all Black people should be slaves. Too much of people's experiences in the world are varied. What we want is consistency. What we want is all lives matter. So I think we all have to think about the language that we use. Is it a Black actor or a Black lawyer? Is it a Black on Black crime? Well, is it a white on white crime, or is it a white actor or a white lawyer? There's a very good book called Me and White Supremacy, which I would encourage anybody to read. It's very accessible and kind of shows you some of the issues. And I am just going to post into the chat now the preliminary, very proud of this, the preliminary, all the Welsh Government, let me see, send to everybody, the Equality Action Plan that the government have just got the first draft of. There you go, 2031. I ran over by a minute. Thank you very much for listening. O diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd.
Thank you so much, Molara. sorry, I just got in a bit of a pickle. I'm muting myself then. That was very amazing. Yeah. Thank you for giving such a personal talk. I think it's really important sometimes, especially as a white person, to hear those stories and quotes from people and from their lived experience, especially the recent stuff, because I think we, you know, as a white person, you hear a lot about microaggressions, and like it's hard to kind of like, oh, what is that? Like, as a woman, I kind of understand that in terms of like microaggressions of gender violence. I really think a lot of what you were describing there were not microaggressions. Those were just aggressions. You know, they were, you know, terrible things. I think that the thing that you said about the importance of figures in authority, and I think this is where the statues and monuments come in as well, and things like the royal family. You know, we need these people in authority, whether it's, you know, the Welsh Government, Carmarthenshire County Council, or your head teacher, whoever it is, needs to be modelling anti-racism, or needs to be a black person modelling anti-racism. You know, that would be an ideal. And thank you also for mentioning Mohammed Hassan. I've been you know, really sort of keeping an eye on that case, and it seems like, you know, the police are going to be held to account. At least that's what it seems to be at the moment. But I would urge everybody to follow that case. I think the more people who are engaged with stories like that. This is a young man who died whilst, well, just after actually he came out of police custody. I also believe that he didn't actually commit a crime. He was just taken to a police station for questioning, and he died very shortly after that in very suspicious circumstances. So I would urge everyone to follow that case. I think the more people follow those cases, the better. Comment on the, you know, part of police social media, and just, you know, I think the police need to know that people generally in Wales are interested, concerned, keeping an eye on things. And the other thing I think that was really important is, like, racism, you know, is going to happen. Let's be honest, it's going to happen in schools, but needs to be the systems, there need to be the systems to deal with it. White teachers, if they are white teachers, and black teachers as well, need to know, like, have systems and procedures. And I think that's why Black Lives Matter statements are really important, because organisations can refer to them. What do we do in this situation? And yeah, not be kind of flailing around, not knowing what to do. So yes, also I just wanted to say, you mentioned philanthropy in a roundabout way. I have yet to come across any philanthropy on the part of PICS, and please, if somebody can correct me, please do so. Rhys might know something about that, but I have never, unlike Colston, who did actually give money to the city of Bristol, PICS, I don't think did anything to help the people of Carmarthen, as far, or Haverfordwest, as far as I know. So if anybody has questions for Rhys or Molara, please put them in the chat, and I will read them out.
Chris has raised a question. Has Brexit made racism worse? Definitely, it has. Definitely. And also Black Lives Matter actually, ironically, made racism better for a little while, but actually, if you see what's happening, it's also ramping up. And I think any time where there's poverty, and there's, you know, the whole thing that's kicking off in Bristol at the minute, all of those things, that there's so many different things that are kind of bound in together, where there's social unrest, where our people perceive that our liberties are being taken away, then people are under pressure to possibly have vaccines and they don't want them, where police officers are abducting and murdering a young woman, and then there's a backlash there. So there's lots of different things that have all gone into a melting pot, but which often come out as racism. So yeah, Brexit definitely made things worse. Yeah.
Someone's asking your cousin's name.
My cousin is Olasheni Lewis, and the law is called Sheni's Law. And we may not need to have it here in Wales, but I think I'm going to be petitioning the Welsh Government next Wednesday very much to adopt it, because I think that's really important. It's really important for us to have transparency and to know what happens to our loved ones very conveniently. I mean, this was in a London hospital, it wasn't in Wales, but I get a bit frustrated that people kind of respond to the death of George Floyd, because I think, well, where were you in 2010? Because Shani was in a hospital, you know, and there are so many other examples of young people, and particularly young Black men, being treated badly by the police. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's another thing that sometimes, you know, might happen with if you are a white British person, is that you think that this happens in America and not in the UK. But if you think that, I would urge you to Google deaths in police custody and race, because the British police do not have a good record on that. Diolch yn fawr iawn, all of you, thank you very much for coming. Diolch yn fawr I dod. I would also like to thank our wonderful speakers tonight, Rhys and Molara, and all the speakers that we've had on this series of talks. I mean, they really have been the most amazing speakers, and if you've missed any of the talks, I'd really urge you to have a look at our YouTube channel, because they're all going to be on there. Quite a lot of them are on there, and yeah, they're really fantastic. I would like to thank our funders, Heritage Lottery and CADU, our volunteers who very much in the background at these events, but do a really great job. Chris, our wonderful technical support, all my colleagues at Oriel Martin, and Paula and Lisa at Carmarthen School of Art. I've been doing book recommendations. I might as well do that now as well. So this week I'm recommending 2 books, and this is really just sort of an acknowledgement of the power of fiction. All the books I've recommended so far have been non-fiction, mainly works about race, and these are 2 books which are fantastic stories, but also cover a lot of issues that are raised in this project, and I do think you can learn so much reading fiction. So this is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. If you don't know Octavia Butler, she is an incredible, or was incredible, she's been dead a few years now, an incredible Black American science fiction writer. I'm so happy to have discovered her. She really is incredible, and her work is all about imagining a new world, imagining new futures, different futures, which I think is really, really key, not only interrogating the past, but imagining what futures might be. And this is quite a new book by Monique Roffey. It's set in Trinidad. It's kind of magic realism. It's about a mermaid. I've only just started, I can't really tell you what it's about, but it's really, really brilliant. I'm really enjoying it. The Mermaid of Black Conch. So yeah, really recommend those 2.